Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. We're very pleased to welcome Nick Beddow this evening, who's going to speak about community organising. Nick's got around 40 years experience in community work and community organising. And as we build the resistance movement that we're hoping to formally launch when the social distancing rules have been sufficiently lifted to make it safe for gatherings to meet together, community organising is going to be an absolutely crucial part of the success of any new grassroots social movement. And so what we'll do this evening is I'll invite Nick to speak for about 5 or 10 minutes with some thoughts about how we might move forward. And then we'll have a conversation and open the floor, as we usually do, to questions from viewers. We'll be on air for an hour, and so there'll be hopefully ample opportunity for people to ask questions. And so if I could hand over to Nick now, and he'll speak, as I say, for about 10 minutes about his initial observations on the way forward. So over to you, Nick, and welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. The question I was asked to think through was, is community engagement going to be one of the greatest outcomes of the pandemic? This new wealth of community activity, is that going to be something that we're going to look back and think, terrible pandemic, but what a fantastic development we've had socially through people getting together? So I'm going to say, first off, I think it's one of the greatest things. I think the other greatest things are around the NHS and key workers being properly appreciated in society, that we've got universal basic income on the agenda now. If the government can suddenly find money at short notice in this way, why can't we do it all the time? And also, I guess we've broken away from the idea of Brexit being the only issue that matters to anybody, with all the nationalist overtones that there has. The other thing I think has been one of the great things is the government's image being dented properly. Too little, too late, PPE, neglected care homes, Cummings, the ventriloquist dummy with Johnson. And I think we've got the Overton's window thing started to happen, where people are starting to shift their thinking away from where they were just a few months back when they voted in an election. So yeah, communities getting active is brilliant, but there's other good stuff as well to build on. First thing I'd say, communities engaging with each other. We've spent so long in this society watching communities disappearing day to day from each other, people travelling away from their homes to work, not spending time talking to each other. It's ironic that it took a lockdown to actually liberate people to build relationships in communities, to have enough time to chat over the fence, to get out there clapping on the streets together, to start talking to each other about how we're going to keep this spirit going afterwards. I know where I live in Hadfield in Derbyshire, the WhatsApp group are already talking about sports days, street parties. Let's build it and keep it going. So we've definitely got something to build on. So that mutual aid from the grassroots shows also it needs to come from the grassroots, not from above. We saw big society as a complete fiasco because it was commanded from top down to people. We saw the government seizing the idea of a national volunteer scheme, which failed to flourish. I mean, most of the people who contacted said they haven't been asked to do anything. But at the grassroots, when the mutual aid groups spring up, perfect organisation, people talking to each other, using media a lot of people hadn't used before and had to learn from their own teenage kids, which is perfect again, using WhatsApp, using Facebook for the first time, to the development of these help websites, people trading for free between each other, schools and what have you. And we've seen in activity a growth in care for each other and for our neighbours and reaching out to find out how people are. Some more sensitivity over, don't just go banging on the door of an elderly person's house frightening them, but think through what's the best approaches. So people are really starting to think hard about how they work with diversity through it. We've seen people contributing here to what do the food banks need, what does the women's refuge need. People are starting to think outside their own four walls. And that is a major breakthrough for me. So we've got assets to build on, we've got new relationships, new solidarities, new caring roles, a new idea that people could do some things themselves and don't have to depend on somebody else to kick it off. So that's the great stuff. The challenge I'm going to struggle with, and struggle with publicly with you tonight, is how do we make it part of a stronger civil society that goes on for long term after this period's ended, so people don't think back like they do about the Second World War. Wasn't it great, all that solidarity? But it soon dissipated as soon as people went back to the normal day-to-day. How do we build on it and build it properly? Well, we know already there's thousands and thousands of small community groups already. Parent-toddler groups, tenant associations, bigger things like credit unions, they're already here and going on. How do we get the energy of these people street to street to actually start to feed into something that feels like we're building local islands, local hubs where people stick together and work things out together? And I think what I'm going to say, my main contribution tonight is going to say it needs facilitation of some sort, whether you call it community organising, community development, asset-based community development, participatory budgeting. I mean, there's so many games in town, and at the moment, they're all competing for franchise money. That's the only game in town, winner takes all. What we need to do is look at all these different good approaches out there, say, harmonise, work together and complement each other. Where there's a resource, let's make it work for everybody. And I'm saying why we need facilitation is because it's great to have new communities, but that doesn't mean that they're automatically progressive communities that are including everybody. Are they reaching out to every neighbour from every background? Or are they just looking after people who look more like them? So there's always a problem with community groups around exclusion, things like that, competitive behaviour, domination. If you talked about in professional circles, we'd talk about hippos, which means the domination by the highest earning person in the room. In a community, there are similar dynamics to watch out for. When I first started, I was part of a nursery campaign in Nottingham. Tories closed the kids' nurseries down. Some of the mothers who voted Conservative on 2 estates formed a campaign, and they looked a damn sight more exciting than the political party meetings I was going to as a 19-year-old. So I packed in the political parties, joined the Save Our Nurseries campaign, went to a demonstration outside the town hall. Now, what would normally happen on the left is we'd be selling newspapers and we'd be waving banners. They didn't. They got a megaphone, the car started moaning at them and blowing the horn because it was holding up the traffic. Then someone had the bright idea to shout through the megaphone, if you support our campaign, blow your horn. And I've never seen such creativity in the so-called professional circles of politics. I saw it there in a community. Great. So we won, kept the nursery open as a workers' co-op. Then you have a problem. And the problem's this. People who are fantastic at being a bull in a china shop as a campaigner are not often the best person to deal equal shares of power within a cooperative, because they're powerful people and they dominate everybody else. So one of our big struggles, I think, in communities is that everybody feels liberated, that everybody who's involved in a community group feels empowered by the experience, not belittled or damaged by it. That way, we don't get the Jean-Paul Sartre quote, hell is other people, starting to mean something as people's experience in a community group. Now, how do we do it? I think the most important thing with facilitation, in Northern Ireland in the 70s, a lot of money spent on community development, trying to bring 2 communities together. How do you justify it? So they created a whole evaluation and planning framework, and they called it Achieving Better Community Development. And it had 5 magic ingredients, which I'm going to go through with you, because I think they're important if we're going to have really healthy community activity. The first one's personal support, so that every individual who comes into that community group has the opportunity to develop their skills and their knowledge and their status within the group. There's an approach called liberating leadership that's really good. It says the leader isn't just the chair or the secretary. Some people lead because they're the ones who make people laugh. Some people lead because they're the person who asks the dodgy question nobody wants to ask. Somebody else leads at noticing people who never speak and encourages them to speak. So there's different ways of working through personal support for people. The next angle is positive action in a group, so that we build groups that are actually democratic and equal and reach out to all sections of the community and ask and try and understand what are the different struggles from people from different backgrounds and what barriers they face to keep staying involved. The next one, self-organisation. People often think of tasks as being the whole thing, but actually in any organisation, it's also people skills. You get to work, they call it human resources and give you very little support at all. In a really well-functioning community group, we should be thinking about what are the rules that people want for themselves, about how you behave towards each other, how you deal with conflict and disputes, so that they've got something agreed between themselves from the start, that they've got some democracy in their group. If they need a constitution, they've got one that doesn't have to be a charity and take 2 years to do, but something that holds them together. And that they've got, from that, for the task, they've got an agreed vision, an agreed plan, an agreed idea of roles, that they know how they can get hold of the resources they need. And that way we avoid what you call the tyranny of structurelessness. Now, if you have no structure at all in a community group, the most powerful people ride and everybody else gets ridden. So there's a few challenges for us to think about building a grassroots that's really healthy, that really is day-to-day socialist in its behaviour towards each other. And the last one is networking and influence. Now, by networking, we mean networking with each other. So it's great to see a community group form on my street, but I'd like the whole of Hadfield to get together at some stage. And then I'd like Hadfield to talk to Glossop. I'd like Glossop to talk to Buxton. And at some stage, I'd like Buxton to talk to Havana. But let's get some networking of people so they begin to learn from each other, understand each other's struggles, understand from each other what works. And then the fifth box, which leads me into participatory democracy, is influence. Now, most small communities moan about the council when they should be moaning about the government. They moan about the government when they should be moaning about the IMF. There's a whole understanding of different layers of political power that affect their lives. Paulo Freire in Brazil used to talk about becoming political from understanding the forces acting on you in your daily life. And that's really important for people. So to become influential, you need two things going on, I think. One, that the community itself is aware of the game and can play it and knows who to get hold of and how to influence. So tactics, stuff that community organising is really brilliant at the moment. Why we're not so strong on is the other side, which is if we've got a voice, we need to have an echo as well, back from the system. Some allies within the system that are going to work with us and offer their support and resources and have their doors open to really listen. So instead of bullshit consultation and other forms of fake participation, we need to be building what we call a 45-degree approach. Not one way or the other, but somewhere where we can meet and actually say, you're a worker, but you could be dead handy to us. And how do we get to that position? So I'm just going to finish by talking about the role of citizens' inquiries and assemblies. You've seen them, the flavour of the month at the moment. What they're about. Citizens' inquiries, or citizens' juries. We call them inquiries in England because there's an American company that's trademarked citizens' juries as a name, would you believe? So what it's about, get a group of citizens, about 20 together, randomly selected, trying to get all different representation of different demographics, get them in a room, meet for about 9 sessions, 3 hours each session, and think together through one key question. I'll give you an example of a question we might use. What would make the most difference to improve people's well-being who live around here? Discuss. And then the group map what's good about living here and they talk, share their experiences. Then they talk about what's not so good, what are the challenges. And from that, they come up with a great long list of issues. And we work through the issues and say, right, who do you want to come in to talk to you about that? And they'll say, well, we've said there's nothing for the youth. Let's get the council in to ask, why isn't there any youth service? Let's get the police to ask why there's nobody visible on the streets day in, day out. Let's get something. And that way they choose the sorts of people they want in the room. And they want them there so they can dig deeper to really think through, well, what are the issues and what responses work? Now, that's amazing to me, because normally you'd say, come to meet an agency, the police or the council, and all you'll get is people throwing abuse at them about you're bloody useless, you're a waste of time, you're a waste of money. What we've got here is people struggling with a question that matters to them, and suddenly this worker from the council or wherever is a resource. And it's a bit like, you know, you don't want to hear a plumber going on about plumbing, but if you're trying to mend the bog and there's water all over the bloody floor, and a plumber happens to come along, you're glad to see him, because they're actually serving you and doing what you want when you want it. And that really builds a relationship between workers in the system and communities based on the issues that matter to communities, but the worker finding, actually, this is helping me do my stuff that I wanted to do as well. Because if I'm a health and wellbeing worker and these people are fighting for their own health and wellbeing, the job's starting to really be done. So that's the exciting bit with them. Problems with them, bottom line, is how do you actually get the system at the end of it all to really change? So this group of people, whether it's an assembly or inquiry, they've done 9 sessions, they've thought it through, they've written their own recommendations, voted on them and prioritised them, had a feedback event, got all the bosses and all the MPs all in one room, and they've listened and they've patted the community on the back and said, well, yeah, that's amazing. But what happens afterwards? And often what happens afterwards is a report's been written, and then the people who ran the inquiry, people like me, go back from wherever I am, 150 miles away from home, come back here, and there's nothing happens to support those communities. And that's a real downfall in situations where the state doesn't really want to change. So what do you do about that? You've got to put a lot of work in to make sure that as you're developing something like an inquiry, you're also developing a community of practitioners whose job it is to understand empowerment, to understand the benefits of empowerment, and to help kick down every barrier and door in the state system that the community come up against, to be proper community champions in their job. That's a massive ask of people, because they haven't been trained to do it like that. They're into health sometimes because they're good at biology, not good at community engagement. So it's a learning circle for the agencies. But you see through them getting involved in the inquiry, they built relationships and they don't feel frightened of the community. They feel close to it and they see the struggle for what it is and want to support it. The other thing that makes inquiries and assemblies work really well is if they're initiated by the community themselves. You see, Extinction Rebellion, a lot of those young people demanding an assembly because they want to get the chance to get everybody together and think through deeply what are the ways that could make life better, sustainably, for the long term, based on the community's ideas. They'll call in guest speakers, they'll call in experts on transition towns, but they don't have to believe them. It's all helping them to dig much, much deeper. The last one, I think, as a criticism of inquiries and assemblies that we need to think about is what happens to the wider community. You know, you might have 20 in an inquiry, you might have 150 in an assembly, massive, but it's still a tiny group compared to the thousands out there. So another approach I've been working on is I'll train members of the inquiry and pay them to go out and talk to their own communities about the same issues, like street researchers, but not like, you know, you hate to see somebody coming at you with a clipboard. If it's your mate and they're saying, now look, we're talking about this, I want to take back more views from more people. Do you think we're on the right lines or are we talking crap? And get people's views and bring them back into the inquiry and challenge the inquiry to say, well, hang on, we need to think a bit more. 20 of us think that's right, but we forgot that perspective. We forgot what it feels like to be a young person with that. And so there's a lot of challenges around that. The pluses of it, and this is why I do it, is because people are so alienated generally from politics and political issues, they don't even want to begin to talk about them at the beginning. I don't believe anything's going to change. You're wasting your time and you're not going to waste my time. And that's the sort of conversation that you can have a lot. And what we say with people in the inquiries is, it's not about being told by anybody else what to do. It's for you to talk about your own lives and bring it together for yourselves, make sense of your own stories. And people like that. because that is the difference between 20th century socialism, which was people telling you what was good for you sometimes, and 21st century socialism, I see it, which is people working out for themselves what will make life better without damaging everybody else. And if we do that, I think we can start to call it socialism.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Nick. And it very much chimed with the sort of aims and objectives that the Festival of Resistance has embraced as an initial starting point once we can get this movement formally launched. Because one of the things we're very keen on, a number of the things we're very keen to do is, as I've already said, raise political consciousness, but also raise expectations in the way in which you've outlined there. And I think very often people's expectations have been, suppressed, ground down into the dirt, and people have no faith in the political and democratic process because they feel it's just not speaking for them or to them and isn't representing their interests. And you think of the coalfield communities that were abandoned, the steel towns, the mill towns, and working class communities in particular have been very badly served over the last 40 years. And I remember speaking to my mum and dad. My mum and dad are of the Second World War generation. They came back after the war and were determined not to go back to the indignity of the means test and the privations that they saw as they were growing up as two working class youngsters. My mum from the north of Ireland and my dad from Derby, but very similar experiences in terms of the sort of exploitation of working class people and sort of not to get above your station. My dad worked in the building industry, for example, and he could never aspire to at that time live in the houses that he was helping to construct. But after the war, of course, things did change. And I know eventually, Thatcher came down, that sense of social solidarity did diminish over the years. But I think there was a post-war settlement put in place. And, I think it could have been stronger, it could have been better. But I think there was a sense of social camaraderie, which sort of lasted to one extent or another, for the best part of 3 decades, really. But of course, the sense of individualism, the Thatcher maxim that there's no such thing as community, only individuals and families, and this kind of breaking down of that sense of community solidarity, the kind of community solidarity that was absolutely essential in a total war situation that the country was facing in fighting the Nazis in the early part of the 1940s, obviously during the Second World War. That sort of had a positive overlap in that sense, and led to the election of a sort of reforming Labour government. And that sense of kind of communal solidarity, I think, and the way institutions were organised did actually stand the test of time. And we saw the National Health Service being created, the welfare state, council housing, and the rest of it. And we had full employment, we had strong trade unions, but all of that has been undermined and dissipated. And trade unions have seen their wings hugely clipped over the last 40 years or so, including during the 13 years that New Labour were in government. And I see our role, if we can bring this off, it would be a huge achievement, I think, is to almost rediscover that spirit of 1945 and to absolutely raise expectations and encourage communities to demand more from their public institutions. And it was music to my ears when you spoke about participatory democracy. And there's some good examples from around the world. I think you cited Brazil, because I think representative democracy, and we make this clear in our aims and objectives, hasn't worked. It isn't working. And I started to ask the question, even though I was a member of parliament, I was one of those representatives. And you have to ask yourself the question, who are the representatives representing? Because it's pretty clear they're not representing the best interests of the vast majority of the British public. Because as I've said on other Resistance TV broadcasts with other speakers that we've had in the, I was going to say in the studio, but in the virtual studio, if they were representing the people that put them into Parliament, then we wouldn't have the numbers of people living in poverty, 14 million in poverty, 1.5 million destitute, thousands sleeping on the street, millions in precarious part-time and zero-hour contract employment, people unable to afford to pay their rent, can't get a mortgage, can't get a council house because there's hardly any being built. These are things that absolutely need to be addressed. We need to encourage, in my opinion, people to demand them. And there are things that local authorities can do even now, even with the strictures that have been imposed upon them from central government, ironically, because of legislation that the Tories themselves have brought in, which allows local authorities, for example, to introduce a redistributive council tax budget, which ensures that the vast majority in the borough pay no extra council tax or even have a reduction. And we ask those with the broadest shoulders to pay a much larger proportion to ensure that we can create something approaching a good and decent society in that local borough. And you then have to go to a referendum because of the legislation, ironically, which has been passed by the Tories, to get such a proposition through. But one of the things I wanted to just ask you before we perhaps invite the viewers, and we're getting quite a few questions coming in on my WhatsApp phone now, they're being relayed to me, is you didn't mention anything about the trade unions in your presentation there, Nick. And obviously the trade unions have been a hugely important force for progressive change ever since they were established, in the 19th century, at the risk of transportation and so on, for the temerity of organising together. And I just think we need to, in my opinion anyway, bring the trade unions with us. They've got, I think, an important role to play. And I think we need to be inspired by those pioneers of the cooperative movement in this country, by the Black Panther Party, for example, in the United States, where there was an abject failure on the part of the state to deliver decent services and to care for the community. They did it for themselves. And this is why I think this community organizing idea that you are speaking about is going to be absolutely crucial, because for the foreseeable future, while Boris Johnson is in office, and even with Keir Starmer, if we had a change in government, there isn't going to be an undue change. There's going to be a massive disturbance to the present status quo. So there's going to be a real need to organize ourselves, for communities to organize themselves, and to start demanding more and better and a greater share of the incredible wealth that this country generates. The problem is that it tends to be absorbed by the 1%, not the 99%. But what's
your question about the unions? I've got about 3 cards here on the unions. I'll be talking for half an hour nonsense. Well, I'm thinking for me, the trade unions also need to be addressed through participatory democracy in the way that they regenerate themselves as living organisations rather than bureaucracies with bosses and hierarchy. So that the whole meaning of unionism starts to mean solidarity, like it did in Poland. People start to get an idea of the trade union is actually your last defence, and it's your mates, and it's everybody together. Now, the nearest I've seen to it in the union movement was Mike Cooley's Lucas Aerospace work, which was like community development taking place in the workplace. They were going to shut down. They'd lost the contract for bombers. And they said, right, we're going to lose everybody. And Cooley and the shop steward said, hang on, we've got other skills we've got here. We could come up with socially useful products using the workers' skills and this equipment. Can we do it? And Lucas, well, they had to, because it was in the press, and they'd have looked stupid if they'd have said no. So having exploited that opening, he's then turned to the experts in alternative production, all these people who lecture on it at universities, and says, come and have a look at our workers and come and work out what they could make that would be socially useful. And they couldn't come up with anything. So then Cooley said, we'll now do what we should have done in the first place. Let's ask the workers. And the workers came up with 150 ideas, and then pulled the experts in they needed to make them. And they made spina bifida carriages. They made safe braking systems for trains, things that were brilliant. And they said to the workers afterwards, what have you gained from this experience? And they said, well, there's 2 things. We don't need a boss. A boss is a hangover from the church and the army. What we need is coordination. And the other one someone said was, I've been doing this for years and I've never seen my skills do anything that was really useful. And then burst into tears. Now that to me regenerates the workplace, it regenerates trade unionism, it's participatory democracy within the workplace, because I think the thing that killed nationalisation was lack of workers' control, lack of an investment in this is my company.
Well, I entirely agree with you on that, Nick.
And that's where we lost our credibility as socialists, we start to look like bureaucrats
Yeah.
and controllers
Well,
rather
I remember
than liberators.
I remember you possibly were campaigning this alongside people like me against the privatisation agenda that Thatcher's Conservative government were pushing forward in the 1980s. And I remember saying to people, look, but we already own the gas, the water, the electricity, but it didn't really feel like we did because they were run by remote bureaucrats, and that's a lesson that we absolutely need to learn, I think. And interesting, and in fact, one of the questions from the viewers actually is in regards to cooperatives, because one of the things that we're very keen to try and do, and obviously there's the Mondragon, which is the kind of perhaps most famous example of a wonderful cooperative organization in Spain that is, I think, the 6th or 7th biggest corporation now in Spain, that was set up during Franco's era in the Basque region by a Catholic priest and half a dozen other people, I believe, who said, if we wait for a rich industrialist or the government to create jobs for us, we'll all die of old age. And they did it for themselves. And somebody's now asking a question, Nick, if you could maybe say a little bit more about how we can organise perhaps a national worker cooperative with local chapters, or encourage a multitude of worker cooperatives. Can you say a bit more about that? Because that's something tangible and practical that can be achieved irrespective of what's going on in government in that sense. And of course, and that is an excellent way. And one of the things I was very pleased in the Labour manifesto last time, because there was going to be a drive towards increasing worker cooperatives and giving workers the right to buy out their company when the company was up for sale. I wanted them to go further and said, yes, that workers should be given the right to take over the company when their jobs are being offshored to low-wage economies, which we've seen hundreds of thousands and millions of jobs go that way. But could you say a bit more about worker cooperatives and how people can go about establishing worker cooperatives? Because we're sort of starting from ground zero, many people, they haven't necessarily got those skills, and where to even start. So can you say a bit more about that, perhaps?
Well, when cooperatives were really flourishing here, we had the Cooperative Development Agency, which was workers who set up many cooperatives themselves, worked in cooperatives themselves, and were able to share that insight with people. The other thing you need to say with cooperatives is it's operating in a capitalist economy. So it struggles like every other small business to survive. So there's a lot of business skills for people to learn, as well as cooperation skills for people to learn. So that really needs skill facilitation. And I'd say if we were serious about reviving cooperatives, we should talk to the trade unions and other people like the Greens as well, anybody who's interested, the New Economic Foundation, about what was the limits to cooperatives that we discovered in the 70s and 80s. Because there were limits, they were fragmented, they were small, they often disappeared overnight. My favourite cooperative in Nottingham was Mushroom Community Bookshop. Broke my heart when I went on Stockport Market and found books for sale that had got mushroom stamped on the inside. I thought another one's gone. So what we need to think of, I think, is rather than a mass co-op, it's how do we build these small islands, bridges to each other, a bit like Venice. What holds it together, ways of walking across to each other and linking together for solidarity. How can they link into the credit union movement for cheap loans so that the business isn't depending always on the cruelty of a system that is horribly competitive and looking to wipe you out? The other one I worry about, if we went too big, is what happened to the credit unions when they go and bond together bigger. While they're small neighbourhood things, everybody knows each other and the common bond is there. As soon as someone gets to scale, you lose the magic bit of common bond. So we need to...
So Nick, just on that point, it's interesting because I used to be a councillor in Derby and I was then council leader, and we were developing an anti-poverty strategy. And one of the very important aspects that we were trying to address back in the 1990s was financial exclusion, obviously. And we supported some credit unions. In the end, we ended up setting up a community-based financial institution, a community bank, as it were. That seemed to be a bit more resilient. But what we found was that with some of the smaller credit unions, one or two did okay and flourished a bit, but many of them, the smaller ones, tended to fail. I think partly because of there wasn't that scale. They were too small. So is there a happy medium? Because can you not be too small as well as maybe too big? I mean, and so how do you actually get that, that magic combination where you're not going too big so you become remote, but you're not too small, so it's very difficult to to actually thrive?
Well, I think there's a medium scale where flourishing credit unions help smaller credit unions. So there's a solidarity between credit unions. Otherwise, you get sucked again into business norms and people go for winner takes all. I found it really difficult to unite 4 neighbourhood credit unions into one because they've got subtly different cultures. And there was a complexity then of clashing, of not just egos, but of the way, this isn't the way we do it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done to support and nurture that. And that's what I'm holding out for.
No, indeed. But does that come back to your point about, and indeed what we were saying in our aims and objectives about trying to kind of, bring organizations, bring community groups, action groups, movements together to kind of network, if not necessarily to merge, but to at least, somehow share best practice and try and work together.
And the same with support workers, network them together so that there's a skill set.
Yeah.
We've got online mapping now. We can actually all contribute to a map that shows what our interests and skills are as communities, as activists, as paid workers. We can find each other on that map, see a bubble, there's 21 people, not too far from me, who are keen on this.
Bear in mind, of course,
exists to do this stuff now.
Bear in mind, of course, that, if we're hoping to rely on statutory agencies to provide some of the support for this, well, that might happen in some areas, but obviously with the way in which local authorities have cut back on the non-statutory sector and their lack of imagination, because as I mentioned earlier on in my opening remarks in that conversation, we were just saying about the opportunity local authorities have to introduce a redistributive budget, but not a single local authority has actually embraced that notion where they could actually stop the cuts and build some headroom for growth and to maybe invest in this type of thing. So bearing in mind that in many areas there will be no support from the statutory agencies for community work, there'll be no professional work in that sense. So this is going to be something that's going to have to be done very much from the bottom up. So
I think there's places
about where you haven't got that infrastructure to give that helping hand. What, as we as an organization, as we build our movement, what do you think we ought to be doing to empower communities where they haven't got that input from a statutory agency to help develop a...
Well, I was reading your website and you was talking about it sometimes feels like we're asking people to climb a mountain. I think we go to some places where they're already 3/4 of the way up that mountain, and we look at what works there and we push for others to adopt the same. So if you look at what's happening in Stoke or in Blackpool or places like that, Preston, if you look at cooperative councils where they're working really well, how can that be a model for everybody else? And then we push like mad for more people to do it. I think, I know a lot of councils say they haven't got resources for that, but a lot of the health workers I'm working with who get involved in the inquiries have been told by their director of public health, whatever their job title is, they are community engagement workers. Everybody depends on that. That isn't doing to people anymore, it's doing with people anymore. And it's changing that culture in a council to think of more workers being people who do with and support activism in the community. So I'm not putting out I'd love to see another 100,000 community workers doing stuff, but I'm looking for a change in culture in the councils, and we need to prove where it works and then push for it.
Interesting. Interesting question here from Shamsha, a woman called Shamsha, saying, given that the government withdrew support and funding for community development, slowly fracturing community infrastructure, is the current organising likely to be seen as a threat to government, as they don't really want empowered communities? I think there's a lot of truth in that. And so that's a sensitive one, even where you might have community workers that potentially could offer some support. Often the powers that be don't want empowered communities. They don't want communities to be demanding things from them. So is that a potential barrier? And how do we get over it? What's your thoughts on that one?
Well, for me, some parts of the council see the community as people to be controlled at all costs. We don't want them demanding more than we can give. We can't afford it. It's the end of. Other parts, like public health, see community empowerment as the way forward, because people who are empowered and start to increase their own well-being, they're increasing their own health and actually helping to tackle some of the very problems in health that public health can't solve from outside. People solve these things from within. And some professions are starting to understand that. We're just on that tipping point where it's not everybody understands it, but there's some leading lights in there who do. And we have to support that culture and keep pushing for it. I think the community organisers, like Community Action in the 70s, the powerful will be scared of it because it's disrupting to them. It's not creative. It's not reflecting what people really want. It's troublemakers stirring others up and pretending they want it. What we're talking about instead is actually supporting people who are clearly saying this is what we want, not what our organisers told us to want, not what our community development worker wants us to want, what we want for ourselves. I think we have to be loud and clear about that. The other thing to watch out for is it's all right for the government to send community organisers in to disrupt labour areas. I'd like to see them send them into Conservative councils and seeing some disruption there as well.
Well, no, indeed.
You know, there's that sort of thing that it's always going to play out like that. I knew when I was a community worker, I was never going to be loved or popular or MBE material. You don't do it for that. You do it because you know normal life cannot carry on like this. Day-to-day life is hell for a lot of people, and they're isolated and they don't know how to get out of it. Communities building bridges to each other. You don't have to climb mountains. We just build bridges between these small islands and we make them more and more connected and grow.
Well, I think this is one of the positive benefits, as I've already said, that I'm hoping that this movement that we're trying to create could actually bring about in that sense, because I mean, we know that most local authorities, or certainly many anyway, are unlikely to embrace this and won't actually, you know, provide the sort of background support that you've talked about, although there are some when we need to kind of build those links. But if we can, like you say, try and put people in touch, not just with people just up the road. I mean, you gave the example in Derbyshire, different places in Derbyshire, about how, you know, people in, I think, did you mention Chinley, talking to people in Buxton, talking to people in Hadfield, etc. I mean, I've had some conversations, preliminary conversations with people up in Cumbria, for example, and people down in Kent doing, you know, similar type of projects, as it were, campaigning in their local communities and community activities and so on, to try and, you know, support the local community. And my ambition, if you like, and hope from this movement is that, as well as putting people in touch with other groups, you know, in the more immediate vicinity, but that we're also hopefully try and get people in touch with groups all over the country and try and support each other with a national network and inspire each other, saying, well, it's something can be done in Cumbria, why can't it be done in places like in Dover, in Kent, or whatever, you know. So hopefully there will be some ability and scope for us to do that. Certainly what we intend to do, but it will obviously be largely dependent upon us, you know, being able to get the necessary kind of momentum behind it, and hopefully that, you know, raise the necessary resources to be able to share some of this stuff, because obviously it will take a little bit of resource to be that effective kind of, you know, clearinghouse, networking body, as it were. There's a question here, though, Nick, from a woman called Leslie Rogers, saying just about organised charities, and asking whether community organisations should be considering pressing for, and whether they're already involved in charities, but working together and merging charities so that they become more effective, I think, is what she's wondering, whether or not there's a case for, rather than being isolated, that we try and bring people together, or organisations together, charitable bodies together. What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, I'd have to go instance by instance, because some charities should be natural partners with each other, and why they aren't one charity already, you scratch your head. And remember when NUPE and NowGo and everybody started talking about Unison? You think, well, why wasn't it Unison from the beginning? How is it all these separate things? So there's historical anomalies, because charities started very strange Victorian ways, a lot of them. And there's a time for actually thinking, do we have common cause here, and could we have more clout and mutual support if we amalgamated? But I'd look at it case by case, because some charities are more radical than others, and bringing a radical charity together with a reactionary cultured one will destroy both.
Indeed.
The infighting that will go on will just take away the energy from what their core mission. So I'll go case by case.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and some charities are kind of become, a bit sort of professionalized in that sense. And of course, with the kind of ill-fated so-called big society that the coalition government were pushing, as it were, as an alternative to public services that were being cut back, clearly didn't work. And I think we're far too, even though there's been these cutbacks, we've become as a society far too reliant upon charitable works, and frankly, we shouldn't. In an advanced society like Britain, a wealthy society like Britain, the fifth biggest economy in the world, be reliant upon charities for basic services. This is where I think, coming back to the point we were speaking about earlier on in our conversation about raising expectations and encouraging communities to demand more of their statutory services to actually provide the services that are needed and that people deserve and contribute to. But
can I add to that, Chris?
Yeah.
I worked two jobs ago. I was chief executive of a community development national charity. We spent more time fighting for ourselves to get our income after it was cut by the government than we did in doing what we were there to do, which was to push the messages of community development. And a lot of charities are suffering so much from financial strain that they're not able to do the radical stuff, the experimental stuff, the stuff that a council's scared to get involved in.
Yeah.
Push the boat out and see what works. That's what I see a charity being there for. They can be trying out new things, but not if they're fighting to survive. And I think
no, I mean, and I think just in my experience, really, in Derby, of a lot of charitable organisations are just forced into chasing the funding, to kind of keep people in post and so on. And so much energy is devoted to funding applications, and it saps energy and takes time away from doing the things what they were established for in the first instance.
And turns them weirdly into competitors against each other rather
than as well, of course. Yes, indeed. Well,
so we're talking network and they're talking individual survival.
No, indeed. But of course, I guess as well, what we're hoping to do with this movement as we create it is, we are going to be hopefully empowering, community organisations to come together. So not necessarily formal charities. And in fact, there are some limitations, I think, on charities actually, and downsides to being a charity, because it makes it harder to campaign politically. Not impossible, but there's all sorts of obstacles and barriers that you need to overcome in order to be doing some of the things that you would wish to do, some of the more radical things particularly that perhaps you'd wish to do. And if you can be free from that, as a kind of unencumbered community organization can be, then that's again something I think we need to be pushing for. And again, for example, a worker cooperative wouldn't necessarily be encumbered in that same sort of way. But just to move on, if I can, to one or two of the other questions. Well, first of all, just there's a hello from Max Cowell and Mark Anderson, who are passing on their regards to you from YouTube. So
Thank you.
You want to say hello to them?
Yeah, I'll say hello to Shamsha and Leslie as well. They're old mates as well.
Nice one. Yeah, great. Well, it's good that we're bringing people together. The wonders of modern technology. Max Cowell is asking a question here, which was about the which local council went for localism last. He heard it was very successful. I think he was referring to. He's asking the question: was it Preston? And I think that's right. I think Preston did look at a more kind of localized model. Again, I don't even think the Preston model went as. I mean, obviously, it shows what a parlous state our local government is in fact, because Preston has been held up as a radical model, and that's the way to go. And I'm not denigrating what Preston did in any way, shape, or form, because I think it is really important the way in which they've approached the whole concept of using the local government sort of power,
procurement power.
Yes, exactly. But I think there's a lot more that they could have been doing. I mean, and they haven't, for example, embraced this localized the ability to introduce a council tax budget, a redistributive council tax budget. I mean, this power has been localized now to local authorities. They can, if they wish, as I've already said, ask the wealthy people in the borough to shoulder the burden, and then you have to get buy-in from the community in the form of a referendum. Of course, because it's never been done before, nobody's at the moment anyway been willing to dip their toe in the water. And as you'll probably know, Nick, if you've worked in local government, officers, senior officers anyway, tend to be incredibly cautious. And I know that the Local Government Association were very nervous about this proposition when I was promoting it a couple of years ago. And indeed, the Labour group on the Local Government Association went to the trouble of writing to every Labour group leader in the country to say that the so-called Williamson model won't work. Well, there was no such thing as a Williamson model. If anything, it was a Pickles model. It was the legislation that Eric Pickles had piloted through the House of Commons. He's hardly a socialist, and hardly anybody who kind of is in favour of redistribution. But the kind of very helpful, I believe, sort of side effect of this legislation that he brought in, which was differential discounts, would allow local authorities to introduce a differential council tax, a redistributive council tax. And they, as I say, they're very, very cautious and said, we shouldn't be going there, and were suggesting that, for example, it would raise more money in conservative areas because there are more bigger properties there and the higher bands, and that more revenue could be raised by simply, I think at that time in 2018, the limit set by the Secretary of State was 6%. But of course, the problem with that was that 6% is the regressive council tax, which applies to everybody. Whereas what I was promoting was an idea where you actually freeze the council tax for 85 to 90% of the population and only ask those with the broadest shoulders to pay the cost. But what's your thoughts about the Preston model? Have you any thoughts on that? And have you got any other local authorities that are doing some great work that we should emulate or be promoting local communities to get their local authority to emulate?
Well, I think people like the Preston people are also closely supported by the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, CLES, and people like the New Economics Foundation are around, people like that. So they're looking at lessons that can be learnt. I'd love to see an assembly of citizens in Preston talking about what's the next stages for deepening participatory democracy in Preston then, to build on this good start we've already had, so that the people aren't feeling badgered by us from political angles, but actually pushed from below by their own citizens. Now, we can do a lot more than this, This is the good start, but it's got to come from underneath as well as from above. Where's the meeting point for these two things? So for me, it's that 45-degree stuff again that Compass has been talking about recently.
Yes.
Start to build that in.
Absolutely. There's an interesting question here from someone asking about making the point that the climate emergency clearly shows just how insane are the notions of infinite growth and endless supply chains. We need entirely new structures which can produce useful things. And I agree. I mean, and I think your example of the Lucas plan that was 1976, and they came up, as you pointed out, with 150 socially useful products that they could use their high-tech skills to actually, develop. But of course, the company
45 years ago as well.
Yes, exactly. It's amazing. I mean, I was really inspired. I've met some of the Lucas shop stewards in the shop stewards combine, because the 13 trade unions brought together led by Mike Cooley, as you rightly say, and it was done in the teeth of opposition from the trade union bureaucracy even back then.
Yeah.
Actually, this was shop floor workers, shop stewards coming forward, and some of the products that they came forward with included wind turbines, solar energy, combined heat and power, hybrid vehicles. This is 45 years ago, 44 years ago, well before the awareness had sort of really developed around the implications of climate change. And if we could actually promote that type of approach, then I think that would be a huge boon, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know what you've got anything more to say about that at all, Nick? Or
I just think it's great that you could bring 13 trade unions to cooperate. Yeah. I mean, we think of that cooperation as only happening in a general strike, wouldn't well, but actually to see that people have actually able to cooperate on a creative basis for actually changing the nature of the workplace. Mike Cooley's book was Architect or Be,
Yeah.
Should a working class person be a slave of the machine or the creator of their work? Should their skills be liberated? We've seen key workers now. We've seen what happens in the NHS. It's cooperation and creativity from people at the grassroots that makes this world work.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, my dad was an electrician. He used to be a miner, and then he became an electrician, then he became an electrician. He used to say, Christ, when you looked at the architect's plans, this clever bugger, if we'd have followed them, we'd have electrocuted anybody who lived in that house.
Yeah.
We put it right at the workplace because we knew what would work.
No, absolutely.
I've seen that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I'm somebody who worked in the building industry myself, and my dad similarly was worked as a plasterer, and and I know many people who've worked in those occupations, and very often you've got to. I mean, my son, in fact, he's a civil engineer right now, and you look at the plans and you think, actually, that's not going to work, and they have to tweak them, on the ground. So yeah, absolutely, there's a lot to be said for that. So I think if we can do or play a part in our movement in empowering people in that way, then I think that would be a thoroughly useful thing to do. We probably just better finish because the time has run away with us, I'm afraid, Nick. But this is perhaps the final question. It's probably an obvious answer, actually. But do you think that MPs are in the job for a career now, rather than because they want to represent people? I mean, my thoughts on that, having been an MP, is that I think, yes, that is the case, sadly. I mean, I think too many people who get into Parliament see it as a career. And I've always made the point, and when I was promoting the Democracy Roadshow in the Labour Party and calling for MPs to be more accountable and for grassroots members to have the right to determine policy, if you like, a participatory democratic structure within the Labour Party rather than this kind of top-down structure that we have at the moment. And this was seen as an incredible threat to the Parliamentary Labour Party and the powers that be, to those vested interests who have that power and don't want to give it away. But one of the points I always made was that being an MP should not be seen as a job. It should not be seen as a career. I always said, if you want a job or you want a career, go and work on a building site like I did, or get a job in a factory, or work in the city or the National Health Service or whatever. That's a career. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with having a career. But being an elected representative is a privilege. And you're there to represent the party and represent the public that elected you. And that seemed to be anathema, regrettably, to most of the parliamentary.
Well, maybe a citizens' assembly on what should be the role of an MP in relation to its citizens would be a really good one.
I agree.
Where they actually start to spell out, it's not about holding a surgery on a Saturday.
No, indeed.
It's about how do our views actually get taken forward? How do we get feedback on what was going to happen next? How do we understand the barriers? How could we actually put pressure from the grassroots to push those barriers? Because there's some things, often you find people who say, well, I'm Director of Public Health, but on this one, I think the community's got more power than me. Because I can't shift my bosses, but they might. Because if the community's going to the newspapers about it, pressure starts to be applied from below. So I think it's something around MPs reconnecting back with their idea that representation means actually finding out what people want, fighting for it in that forum, and then coming back to the people and saying, this is what's happened. Then you can start to even begin to talk about you being a representative. On top of that, for MPs to actually to be trained to understand the importance of participatory democracy day to day in the quality of everybody's life. Because that's
democracy threatens the present status quo, and I suspect many MPs will probably be the current crop anyway, would be reluctant to embrace it, but I think it shouldn't stop us from pushing for it.
No, and there's been great MPs. I'd name them. Bernie Grant was fantastic. When
no, absolutely. Yeah, no,
we couldn't get a ban through immigration for an African festival. Ring Bernie Grant, and he's off to Dover within 5 minutes. It's
not to damn every MP, but I was really talking about the present crop of individuals. I mean, yes, of course, there've been some giants over the years. Nye Bevan, Tony Benn, Michael Foot. There's been many excellent parliamentarians who kind of understood that, and they were very much, if you like, people who men of the people, if you like, tended to be men. I mean, although there was some great women. I mean, Barbara Castle was.
Oh, but yeah, I was going to say.
And Joan Maynard was another. But Nick, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Our hour is up. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time and speaking to us about community organising. And we'll certainly be wanting to work with you as we develop our movement. And your advice and counsel, I think, will be invaluable. And if you can put us in touch with other people that you're in contact with in different parts of the country, because we do have thousands of people who have already expressed an interest in being part of this movement. And what we need to try and do is, if I can impart those ideas, those skills, that confidence really to organise their own communities. Because look, this movement is only going to work if it is active in every community in the land, and it has to very much be a bottom-up movement, that actually, makes a difference on the ground in each and every local community. It can't be done from the top, and we're not seeking to do that, but we will need the support of people like yourself, Nick, to make that work. And thank you very much indeed for speaking this evening. Hopefully you'll come along to the Festival of Resistance, the conference, the weekend that will be taking place. It's going to be held in Derby, probably looking at May next year now, regrettably, with the pandemic. But we're hoping it will be a great conference. We've got speakers from all over the world who will be coming to address the gathering. It's not just about having a great conference, it's about hopefully inspiring people to go back into their local areas and start this revolution, which is what it's going to take. Yeah. So thanks again to you, Nick. Thank you everybody for watching. We will be putting a link out to this discussion that we've had this evening, so you can share that around to people who've not had the time to watch it tonight, because I think this is going to be a really important one of the series of programs that we've done, because there's a lot of great learning ideas that Nick has put forward this evening. So thanks again, thanks for watching, and good night.